with that, hello everyone, I am Becky. This is Deb. Say hello, Deb.
Oh, I can speak. Hello.
I permit you to speak. Yes, thank you to those who have joined in, possibly off the back of the Instagram story that I posted yesterday where I asked a whole bunch of questions about your experiences with what I was referring to as ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. We may or may not get into the semantics of how one might refer to autism or ASD or people with autism or autistic people, etc. We might get into that a bit later. We may do another episode about this and the semantics at a later date. But today, what I really wanted to share with you all via Deb, so what I wanted Deb to share with you all was our experience with autism. Now, technically, first of all, by no means at all would Deb and I be considered or consider ourselves neurotypical. Not a chance. So neurotypical is essentially a phrase that kind of means you've got a regular brain. Your brain kind of just works how it should. And if you are not neurotypical, you are neurodivergent. These are relatively new terms. I'm not sure that they came from diagnostic language or the internet. I've been Googling all sorts of things in the last 24 hours and actually for the last couple of years about all of this sort of stuff because there's a lot of talk about autism at the moment. Online, social media, mostly social media, honestly. I'm seeing a lot of it, Deb is seeing a lot of it, and we've lived with autism. I've lived with it my whole life. Deb's lived with it for 33 or odd years, and when I say we've lived with autism, I'm referring to my brother, Deb's firstborn, Joseph. If you are here from my Instagram or even my Facebook, you're probably familiar with some of the stuff I've shared when Joey has come to visit. It's pretty apparent that he is not what could be considered neurotypical. We're not experts, we're not doctors, we are just a couple of gals doing our best. And we have a loved one with, Deb, would you say with autism or who is autistic?
Well, what I might say, I'm still trying to examine whether it is now politically correct to say, and just exactly what the difference is between an autistic person or a person with autism, which is one of the many reasons that we've probably ended up where we are now, discussing these things. So, without thinking about it, I would say Joey has autism. But never stop learning, so perhaps there is a better way to say it. Going back in time, what's prompted this today is this book. And I don't know whether that reverses it when you look at the camera, but it's by Clem Bastow and it's called Late Bloomer, and it's how an autism diagnosis changed my life, which is part of the latest, greatest thing, which I'm trying to keep an open mind and understand what it's like to, say, in Clem's case, get to 36 years of age and then get diagnosed with autism. And for the most part, try to understand in relation to how that might help me understand Joey better. And there's a lot of things that are unknown about autism and a lot of misunderstandings. I would be now what's known probably as an autism mum, which is apparently very different to being diagnosed with autism late in life. And that's where some of the difference comes. So I'm going to start off by a quote that says, "Academia, it will not surprise you to hear, tends to be overpopulated by autists." Now, I can appreciate that autism, ASD is autism spectrum disorder. So it is a spectrum. Now, my experience of the spectrum is at the other end. So whilst academia may be full of autists, so are special schools. And that's obviously a different end of the spectrum and a whole different experience. So I'm trying to understand how the two interrelate and how they may benefit each other to understand, because they seem very vastly different at the moment. So to go back in time, Joey was born in 1988, supposedly quite neurotypical, if you can tell that from a baby, until he was about 9 months old, and he actually started having seizures. Don't know the statistics, but back in the day, it was not uncommon for someone autistic to also have epilepsy. Now that the autism spectrum has been expanded so much, I'm not sure if that's still the case. So we were in the system seeing specialists, we were in hospitals, we were getting tested. And if anything, we kind of thought that was our lot in life. It's like, oh, we have a child with epilepsy. That's okay. I read all the books that said you can have epilepsy and be normal. Didn't occur to me that it would be anything else. It's like, we're epilepsy parents, not autism parents, hadn't even heard of autism. And we had quite a lot of trouble getting Joey's seizures under control or managed, and he still has seizures to this day. So it wasn't until he was about 18 months old when we went for a standard checkup, and it was a fill-in paediatrician that started asking questions like, oh, can he do this? Can he do that? Can he stack blocks? Can he, feed himself? I can't even remember now. They were pretty basic things. And I was answering the questions. I was like, no. And then, of course, I said, should he be doing these things at this age? And they said, let's find out. So sent us off for assessment, which came back, quite a shock to say, significantly developmentally delayed. And in the middle of this, I think about that stage, I was already 7 months pregnant with Becky. And then we moved from the Gold Coast to the Sunshine Coast. And then couple of short months later, the very day that Becky entered the world, at just after midnight on a Sunday night, I had a paediatrician appointment on the Monday morning. So I very delicately wandered across the road. Fortunately, the appointment was directly opposite the hospital, and went to see the paediatrician, who said that on parting that this little boy would have a lot of problems in life. And I remember looking back over my shoulder, puzzled, because he was a happy kid. He was very joyful, and he's very much the same today, 33 years old. So he hasn't really changed a lot in terms of his personality or the presentation of his temperament. So I didn't really understand what this little boy who was going to need a lot of help would actually mean. Obviously, over the last 30-odd years, we have figured that out. It was still some time we started therapy. To me, a developmental delay was simply a delay. It's like you call the boss and say you're delayed for work. And it doesn't mean you're not going to get there. You're just going to be a bit late. So we started intense therapy, and never for a minute thought that he wouldn't catch up to his peers and go on to just lead a relatively normal life. It wasn't that long into the situation with the newborn baby that some of the issues started to present themselves. One of them that has been a lifelong issue for Joey is sound sensitivity, which was really unheard of, unknown in the day. But it presented itself, of course, with the newborn baby who, would cry when she was hungry or cold or needed a nappy changed or whatever babies do.
And still to this day.
Some things don't change. So the piercing cry we didn't understand was extremely painful to Joey. He had no ways to express himself. He didn't know how to communicate that. So he would actually try and just shut the noise up by hitting it.
Noise.
His baby sister.
The noise.
And so he's just like, stop the noise. So it was quite difficult for everyone, for him, for Becky, for me, and thinking, what the hell is going on? It wasn't the usual big brother jealousy of a new baby. It was obviously distressing for him. So, we really didn't have any idea. Autism was relatively unheard of back in the day, and there was a lot of misinformation. One of the things going around that I recall was the refrigerator mum, which you don't hear much of these days, but there was a theory that autistic kids are kind of made by cold mothers who don't bond with their children. So the babies don't respond because it's the mother's fault. So, a lot of guilt the mum. So as part of the therapy that we were going through, I had a wonderful therapist at the time who understood Joey quite well, who thought, let's see if we can get a proper diagnosis. And she called in the expert at the time, who was still a big expert, who I won't name at the moment in case I get into trouble. And he came in, and he had a colleague with him, and he seemed more intent in impressing the colleague than actually getting to know Joey. And all of 10 minutes that he observed Joey, the one thing that ruled him out in the specialist mind was that in the pool of toys, Joey didn't pick up Thomas the Tank Engine, which was a stereotypical interest for autistic kids to be obsessed with Thomas the Tank. What Joey did was pick up a guitar, and that in itself was what the specialist said was a fairly neurotypical wasn't the word he used at the time, socially appropriate, I think, a socially appropriate toy to choose. Now, if he wasn't so distracted by trying to impress his colleague, he might have asked more about that and found out that it was a highly socially inappropriate obsession with guitars that still exists to this day over 30 years later. So obsessions are one of those things that stands out for autists. Sorry, I'm not going to use that word. I hate it. I'm not on board with that as yet. So, yeah, so what he did label him as at the time was PDD-NOS, which basically means there's clearly something weird about your kid, madam, but we haven't got a fucking clue. Sorry, are you allowed to swear on this? I didn't ask that. So it stands for, and I'm reading this now to make sure I get it right, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So that's where we started. Basically, they just didn't like to diagnose kids that young as autistic. They waited till they were about 5 or 6 back in the day to see if they would grow out of it. So Joey didn't grow out of it. He continued to confound and confuse us and was confounded and confused himself, and that still can continue. He's still wonderfully personable, charming. People love him. He makes people laugh, but he's still, I would say, the impact of autism affects him greatly every day.
So he was diagnosed with this category of he's not quite on the level, but they were reluctant to diagnose autism. So when did you first start to hear the word officially, or when did the whatever clump of letters it was, I don't remember, when did that shift into autism?
I think what happened initially is that we were at what was the therapy centre, and they trying to, implement these therapies. They didn't know a lot about autism either. I think there was one day and the therapy was over half an hour, and I'm not the most organised person, and for whatever reason they gave us like an 8:30 appointment in the morning, which was like get 2 kids up, get the autistic kid ready that we didn't know was autistic, feed the baby, get myself ready, drive half an hour, get to the appointment. That was like, oh my God, I was stressed. And Joey had stopped eating. He would only eat very few foods, and that was all a textural thing, which is another autistic thing we didn't know about, which Becky's already thinking, I do that. Does that mean I'm autistic? Yes, probably. But he'd stopped. He'd narrowed it down to only 2 or 3 foods and had lost a lot of weight. And it was one day when they did some water therapy, and so they took his shirt off and could see that he was quite thin, and they finally listened to me when I said, he's not eating. And they went, oh, maybe we should do something, these kids something or other, and these kids something or other. And I said, I had the flu, I think, 6-week-old baby, flu therapy, 8:30 in the morning. I said, what do you mean these kids? What are you trying to say? And I pretty much said to them, because they all just went silent and looked at each other, I said, are you trying to say he's retarded? Because, of course, that's a word that used to be an apt description that isn't used anymore because it's socially inappropriate, but it's not an inaccurate description. His development was retarded. It was held back. And yes, he is retarded. That's just not a word that we use because of the stigma attached to it. He's intellectually impaired or delayed, or I'm not sure what the latest appropriate term is, along with the autism. And I think at that stage, I probably tried to hedge my bets with a label. Is it going to help him to be labelled autistic, or is it going to hold him back? So I don't think I had him diagnosed officially, because it's not like you can do a blood test. Oh, yes, it's shown up on the results that he's autistic. It's just somebody's opinion, and it still is. So if it helped as he got older, I would say he's autistic. If I didn't think it would help him in any way, I would just say he was intellectually delayed or impaired, or there's another word I can't think of at the moment. It'll come to me. The autism label, I'm trying to think. I don't know that we ever got an official written, yes, your child is autistic.
I think that's interesting that the autism label was just applied, because that's actually something that we've been seeing a lot lately, but in quite a different format. It's individuals that are noticing behaviors or traits and then going like, that's an autistic thing or an autism thing, and therefore I am. But we might explore that a little bit later. Someone did ask in the chat, did any relatives or friends notice symptoms in Joey?
I certainly didn't notice it because he was my firstborn child. We didn't have any other friends or relatives around with young children to compare milestones. It was also quite in vogue at the time to not have milestones. Like, in years gone by, there have been like, oh, they must walk by this, they must talk by this. They have dates and times and ages. This was an age where they're like, oh, they'll do it when they're ready. Don't worry. Don't measure them. So I wasn't particularly worried. He was a curious, inquisitive baby. He was very happy. Some of that could have been the drugs he was on for the epilepsy that made him very happy. I wasn't aware that he should be doing all these things because he was just a great kid. He was actually a very easy baby, which is why I decided to have another one. And like I say, it wasn't until after I was well pregnant that I realised that there were a few more issues. And even then I thought it wasn't a problem. But it was around when he was about 2, which was around about the time that Becky was born. And I'm not saying that to say, oh, it's because Becky was born that he changed. I think it was just developmentally that it was around 2 that his issues started to become much more problematic for him and for us. And that's when he became much more difficult. Up until then, he was, I'd say, a dream baby. Along with the autism, like I say, there was a lot of misunderstanding. There was not a lot of information at the time. And after a while, you realise that the experts don't really know that much more than you do. I think I did read something somewhere about, I think it was Erin says, not that now that so much time has passed, how do you feel about the autism label for Joey now, especially in terms of how much it affects him compared to other conditions? And that's a brilliant question, and I'll probably try and answer that in 2 parts. A couple of years ago, Joey moved out of home when he was 18 into supported accommodation. And whilst I still was very much involved in every part of his life, it was not quite the same. Whereas a couple of years ago, I moved him back into what was the family home in Queensland, and I took over his care. So I became involved in a much more intimate level again after many years of battling with agencies. And through that closer connection again, the number of times I've turned around and said, I didn't realise how autistic he was, which sounds weird to have a nearly 30-year-old and say, oh, I didn't realise he was that autistic. And even looking back on his childhood, it's like, oh, he was really autistic, wasn't he? So the more I understand autism, the more I understand how hugely it has impacted Joey and us. Question. The second part, and this is where I have to be really cautious because those on, it's not a higher functioning is not an appropriate thing to say anymore. So I'm not up with the right language. So I'm bound to say something that will upset someone. So I apologise in advance if I do. But the more able to communicate people who are diagnosed as autistic seem to have taken it upon themselves to be the spokespeople for everyone on the autism spectrum. But I'm finding that their experience of autism is vastly different to my experience. And I did, not really jokingly, I did say to Becky, would you consider, should we invite Joey to this chat? Which is funny because Joey can't tell us how he feels or what he thinks, or he can't tell us when he's in pain. He can't tell us when he's sick. There's so many things that the autism, not the intellectual disability, but the autism prevents him from processing and understanding and being able to express, which is distressing. So when someone pops up and says, oh, I'm 42, I've married with 4 kids and I've just finished my PhD and I've just found out I'm autistic, I find it very hard to understand what that means. But I am trying to keep an open mind and learn and figure out how that can help me to understand Joey and his experience of the world. I still find even today, Joey, because of his personality, because he has quite a effervescent personality, that people just tend to see that. and they just think, oh, he's just lovely, he's charming. What's the problem? Even at, I think when Becky was around, I'm guessing 14 or somewhere around that age, she had a friend come and stay who had known Joey for many, many years. But she came and stayed with us for a couple of weeks. And after the first, I think it was only a few days, she kind of turned around and she said, wow, I always knew that Joey was Joey, but I had no idea what it was like.
I didn't know he was that Joey,
Yeah, I didn't know he was like that Joey, yeah. Somebody asked about assisted speech, and yes, we have tried. Joey is verbal. He can talk. He can tell you that he wants that guitar, and he could probably tell you that he wants a 12-string white Les Paul guitar, but he can't tell you when he's about to throw up or whether he's in pain or, basic communication, two-way communication, interaction is a very different situation altogether. So the ability to talk is not necessarily the ability to communicate. There are autistic people who are non-verbal who can communicate with assisted communication means. So once again, how does that fit? It's not a straight line, this spectrum. It's very kind of piecemeal. Somebody else mentioned something about those who can communicate is very different to those who don't have the capacity to communicate. And I think that's one of the big thing that I'm seeing, especially with the more vocal, more verbal, more articulate, more educated people who are coming out as autism. I think that may be a thing. And that's where they're saying like, oh, nothing about us without us. And there's a hashtag actually autistic. And I think that a part of their autism, that they're articulating what autism is like for them and assuming perhaps that it's the same for everyone. And that's where the autism mums come into it, because I think just to bring that into context, it would be like there's a lot of people who celebrate being autistic. It's wonderful. It's a blessing. It's something to be celebrated. And I'm like, you may be fine the way you are, and that's fine if you want to celebrate it. But if there were a pill to take away the autism that impacts my son's life every day, I would take it for him and for everyone around who cares for him, who tries to help him, look after him, communicate with him, who's on the receiving end of his tantrums, of his stress, of his anxiety, of his distress. I would take that away for him, yes. Another thing I want to mention is Asperger's. We haven't kind of mentioned Asperger's, which used to be a separate diagnosis, which used to be considered on the higher end of the spectrum.
I was just going to say it's now what's considered level 1 autism, but once again, I kind of touched on that before, how that doesn't really clear anything up. Back to you.
Now, the other one I just want to mention quickly that I'm only just starting to recognise myself is autism in women. And that's where the masking comes into it. If you're not familiar what masking is, it's something that there's a lot of girls and women who don't get diagnosed because they have the ability to mask, which means they present as neurotypical, which is an awful toll to try and appear neurotypical. Now, I'm not quite sure why that's only girls and what do the boys do, but there does seem to be, in this more vocal end of the spectrum, a lot more women than men. Just to throw another thing in there, Rain Man. We haven't touched on Rain Man yet. And basically this comes about because a lot of people kind of think that he's autistic, what's he good at? When they see that he's obsessed with guitars, they think he's going to be the next Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix. Joey, he strums the guitar badly, and that's about as good as he's gotten. He's never going to be a maestro guitarist. He just loves guitar.
Not for lack of practicing every day for hours on end his entire life.
He doesn't actually like to see other people play guitars. People think, oh, I'll take him to see music. He doesn't want to go to watch other people play guitars. He'd rather go to a guitar shop, partly because there's too much noise, too much unpredictable noise at a concert. People screaming, people cheering, clapping. That's noise that is distressing. He would be like this, like trying to get away from that noise. There's the feedback on, guitars and sound systems. That's like, but back to the Rain Man thing. One of the things that Becky and I started talking about, you may have read about the controversy over Sia's recent movie called Music. And Becky, was the character her name Music, or was that the sister's name?
The autistic character was named Music.
Right. So the girl in the movie was named Music. Now, I don't think Sia ever claimed she was actually autistic. The autistic community have jumped on board that and have given an awful lot of negative feedback. Now, interesting, I mean, apart from having an autistic son or a son with autism, I photograph at a special school every year, and I have done for about the past 20 years. And that girl in Sia's movie could have been any one of those children. Back to the Clem Bastow book, I remember reading a review on Sia's movie from Clem, who went to watch the movie and said that it was quite shocking to her because this is not the autism that she saw in herself. So, and I'm like, well, that's exactly the point, isn't it? It's a spectrum. If you're a purple colour on the spectrum and you go and someone's showing the green colour, it's not going to look like you, but that's no more or less autism. But it's very hard to compare with dealing with someone with such high needs. I know severely autistic people, and the trauma and stress that they and their families go through every day is just incomprehensible unless you're close to that or have experienced it. This is not like, oh, I have trouble with social experiences and I didn't get that joke and my autism, like, I'm sorry, that's a different experience altogether. Once again, not trying to minimise it, but really don't know how to compare the two.
It's incredibly difficult to talk about this stuff because of we want to be sensitive to people's experiences. They aren't our experiences. We can't say your experience is not as impactful as my experience. And yet I do feel personally that our experience and Joey's experience is underrepresented in the media. And then for the character in Sia's film, there are a lot of problems with that film, but the representation of, as Deb said, Sia never declared it was autism. There was controversy around that as well. I think she said special abilities, and we don't say that because, it's... Anyway, we're not going to dive into that. We've been at it for an hour, which is pretty good, and I would love to do this again. Deb's going to reply to some of your comments in a second, but for people to kind of reject the portrayal of that character and say that's a caricature, that's not fair, it's that's how people used to bully me by behaving like that, and they're expressing all of this beautifully clearly in published articles, and yet Deb and I actually see and know plenty of people much like that character is represented, and that's autism too. So I think it's just, this conversation is to start exploring more than perhaps what we're just seeing on TikTok, which, once again, valid, important, helpful, and if it makes you feel validated and informed and helps you understand your experiences and the things you've struggled with for your whole life, I think that's incredible. And I would love that, for me. But it's just, spend a day with Joey, and I think all of the TikToks you've watched might feel different or be perceived differently.
I don't know if there's any specific questions that I want to address, just in terms of that the comments have been really interesting. Even one of the most recent ones, yes, thank you, my family members don't get represented. What you're doing is well needed, I think. And I think that representation is possibly what we're getting at, because there's a very loud voice out there of autism now. And there's also animosity, and that's what concerns me. It's because that end of the spectrum are so vocal that they're silencing, never mind the fact that the people at the other end of the spectrum are just barely getting through the day intact. They are extremely stressed, and it is a difficult job. I don't want to whitewash how hard autism can be. It's not always something to be celebrated. It is something to be grieved. It is something of an everyday, all-day challenge. And I think that the side of things that I think is getting drowned out by the more vocal ones who are celebrating what their autism means to them. And I think that's why we're having this conversation. It's not like I'm trying to silence that experience, but their voice is starting to drown out the other end of the spectrum. I have no idea what's in the middle. I'm also trying to figure out, and I think someone mentioned something about what is neurotypical. And I'm like, yeah, what is neurotypical and where does it become neurodivergent? Where does that become a disability? Where does the spectrum start? I'm not saying everyone's a bit autistic, but there are people who are all very different. We don't all like the same food. We don't all like the same movies, same interests, same tastes. When does that become not normal? Someone's just said, is the spectrum too big? And I think, yes, it is. I think that somehow we are talking about two different fields and it would be better to somehow differentiate between. That might help.
I'm just going to jump in there and just on that topic, because I think we're in this really interesting time where we've got more information than ever. We're more connected than ever. We're also a lot more open to new ideas and experiences than we have been. People are feeling more empowered, like they have a voice, like they have a community, which is usually online. So we're hearing more stories and we're trying to accommodate and we're trying to say we're listening. When I say we, I mean, I don't even know, society, the good people in society that want to do better, they're going, so turns out girls do get autism. We just were ignoring them and their symptoms because girls do what they're told and we've really trained them well to just do as they're told. So they like learned masking, no worries, and have just moved through their life neurotypical. And now it's like, fucking pull the blanket off of that rubbish. That's not the case at all. They have people who've been really struggling with sensory issues their whole life and communication and social and all that sort of stuff. So it's almost as if the spectrum grows and grows and grows and grows to accommodate different experiences and the learnings that we are probably every day taking in. Because if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. You know, it doesn't really look the same in anyone. But it has gotten to this point where we're kind of exploding the spectrum, and we now need to look at perhaps picking up some of the pieces and seeing how and where they fit together. Is that in a level 1, 2, 3 model, or the previous 5 diagnoses levels of autism, of which Asperger's was 1? I don't know. It's incredibly complex. It's incredibly complicated to put a system around people's experiences, especially sensory and social experiences. It's going to be incredibly challenging and incredibly important, but perhaps the more we learn about it and the more we learn about neurodiverse people and their sensitivities and just how many of us there are, maybe if we can start making society a little bit more appropriate and accepting for people with different needs of all kinds. And of course, there'll always be the extremes where you can't literally take care of every single need of every single person. Unfortunately, it's just not possible. But we're starting to see more and more, you know, certain, I can't remember if it was Coles or Woolworths doing their sensory hour shopping, that sort of stuff. Somebody messaged me yesterday off the back of my Instagram poll saying that their university allows that individual who's been diagnosed with ADHD, they're able to go into an exam and they're allowed 10 minutes of nervous energy time, essentially. They're allowed 10 minutes to essentially sit there and be like, well, I don't know, it's going to be, I don't know what's happening, I don't know. And they're like, we recognize you need that time. You take that time and get started when you're ready. You know, people are trying to be better, but in that, we can't just cater to the loudest voices. So having open conversations and not just receiving your information from one spot or basing it on your own experience or experiences of people who are much the same as you, it's going to work wonders. And I even put on at the end of the polls that I did, we should have some kind of hackathon where we come together to try and fix society for the neurodivergent and say, enough of this rubbish, we're sick of it. Let's have a little bit of quiet. Let's turn the lights down a bit, you know, and figuring out what the needs are so that more people can move through their day with less overstimulation and lead ups to meltdowns and challenges. And it's an incredible moment in time where I think people want to do that, but we're still not entirely sure how. And we might, in our efforts to be better, we might be getting it wrong and potentially missing a few important pieces of this ridiculous puzzle.
A couple of things that I wanted to throw out there. One of them is just to mention a thing called pathological demand avoidance, which I've only discovered fairly recently. And it's made a huge difference in the way that we approach requests of him. But a part of that is to give him processing time. And I think this is one of the biggest things that we've gotten better at in recent times, is to recognise that it's not that he doesn't understand, it's that he does need more time to process what we've said. And also, depending on the stimuli, I think that a lot of people are probably familiar, even if they don't know much about autism, about eye contact. And when Joey was young and in therapy, they tried to insist on eye contact. I don't do that with Joey anymore, because it's very difficult for him to process. And you'll find with a lot of autistic people, their senses are either hyper or hypo. So Joey's very hyper. He's got hypersensitive hearing, hypersensitive touch, hypersensitive taste, smell, touch. So that sensory input is overwhelming. So if you can kind of eliminate a few of those things and give him a little bit more time to filter out what's extraneous kind of input, then he can often come back in his own time and respond. But that takes patience and time and understanding, which leads me to what Becky was saying before about the benefits of this greater discussion. In so many areas, what we want more of, or what would benefit people, is more tolerance and more understanding. If you've known anyone in a wheelchair, it's really not until you do that you realise how many fucking steps there are in this world and how many places are inaccessible for people in a wheelchair. So the issues are very real. They're just very different. You know, it's you can physically see if you're in a wheelchair, you can't get up the steps. If you're autistic, it's not as easy to see what the obstacles are, but they are just as real.
I think Deb and I have been on a bit of a journey over probably the last 2 years, maybe 3, as we've seen more and more content being shared by autistic people. It started out that we were frustrated. We thought we were angry because Joey can't tweet about what it means to be autistic, but this person's told us what it's like, and that's a bit privileged in and of itself, you know. But once again, we're now really trying to learn and understand and broaden our understanding, and we've been comparing a lot of stuff to Joey and our experience with Joey, and even the people from the special school that Joey went to and Deb photographs each year. Like, we see a lot more extreme presentations of autism than TikTok shows, and we were angry at the underrepresentation. That being said, interestingly, if I check myself, and I do try, or if I find myself getting angry about something, I try to understand what is it that's pissing me off and how can I learn more about myself and about what's upsetting me. And I've actually learned things about autism that I can apply to Joey now, and how I deal with Joey, and how, you know, how perhaps I was expecting something of him before that was unfair to expect of him. I'm much more aware of sensory things now, and maybe that's because someone on TikTok told me about it, and I've been able to apply it. Whether or not it helps Joey, can't confirm.
Someone's just said what causes his meltdowns. It's really only in the last probably 2 years that it's been a concerted effort to try and look at things differently and understand what the world's like from his point of view and understand it. I actually think we've made pretty good progress. Along with the autism comes a very high degree of anxiety. Anxiety is something that Becky and I are not unfamiliar with. And so when we try to relate our own experience of what anxiety feels like to us and then try and put it in an autism context, everything Joey does, every part of the autism creates anxiety. Understanding that, it goes a long way to trying to avoid a meltdown. The other one is overstimulation. So you'll often find when Joey has a really good day, really brilliant, lot of fun, he's happy, it does actually take a lot out of him to be able to do that, especially if there's different situations. I think a recent day for me, I took him from the Sunshine Coast to Brisbane for the day. We went on the bus, we went on the train, we went on the City Cat. These are all his choices. He loves these things, and it was fantastic. When he got home that night, he just had the biggest meltdown, and it was not that he was having a tantrum, it's not that he was unhappy about anything. It was just almost like too much stimulation for him. And
that's interesting. I think that's quite similar to, if people watched the Instagram story I posted a little while ago called the Great Bad Day, which was a which was meant to be a play on words because it was a great day, and then it just went to absolute fucking shit. And it was so good, and then it was so bad, and I was like, why? Why am I being punished? We've just had the best day ever. Why is this happening? And I was so upset because I thought I'd done everything right. And, you know, the day ended with Joey having the biggest meltdown at me, incredibly aggressive, and he kicked my camera gear. When he got out of the car, he got out in such a force that my camera bag fell out of the car, and then my camera and lenses kind of were loose there, and he piffed it at full force into my parked car from about that distance, straight into it, and a lens shattered and bits fell off my camera, and I just couldn't believe what was happening because I just didn't know what went wrong. He asked me for Hungry Jacks for dinner, and I said, no, we were having dinner at Mummy's. I'm like, is it because I didn't give him Hungry Jacks? What have I done? And it's just, I think you're right. I think it was a really big day for him because I filled it with things that I knew he would love. You know, I haven't seen you in a while, Joey. Let's go do some of your favourite activities. We're going to go see a tractor. We're going to go to JB Hi-Fi. We're going to do all this great stuff. I can't even do that anymore. Yesterday, I went to brunch and then did uni, and I was like, I'm done. I cannot do another thing. You know, it's the same. And like you said, that anxiety is not to be underestimated. It's tiring.
So that stimulation, it's almost like it just reaches a tipping point. And I know that it's just as distressing for him as it is for us. It's hard not to take it personally because he directs it more so at people he's closer to because he feels safer. But that's because he's trusts us and feels safe to be able to kind of like, I can't do it anymore. But it's very distressing for him and for us.
Look, I think we should leave it there. As I said, I'd love to do this again and talk about all of this and more, perhaps some more specific details. Perhaps I'll post some more questions and get a little bit more of a feel for how people, what people want to know. This has been episode 1 of Sensitive Neurowhatever Person, and I would love to do this a bit more. I hope that Erin will agree to appear with me frequently, or more than frequently, because we talk about this stuff a lot as well. And, you know, Erin's got their own stuff going on. I've got my own stuff going on. It's all happening all the time. Deb is showing us a book that she is reading at the moment, Clem Bastow's book, which did prompt Deb to kind of go off on a bit of a rant at me because that was an individual who was diagnosed later in life and had a lot to say and perhaps was not considering her or their peers on the spectrum, perhaps more like Joey. Not sure. We'll get Deb's thoughts on that book when she finishes it, and maybe I'll have a crack at reading it too if I can bear to or pay attention to a page for more than 4 seconds. All right, thanks everyone. Good night.